What's going on, Berean Baptist Church family? Pastor Dave here. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Follow-Up, where we follow up the Sunday sermon to go deeper into the sermon scriptures. Well, it's just wonderful to know that we are 1 week away from wrapping up our series, Partnership and the Community of Christ, Paul's letter to Philemon. Did you ever think you would ever take 4 weeks to explore this little letter? Well, I want to follow up this past week's message by taking you a little deeper into the scriptures that we considered this past week. Philemon 12 through 16. There is one verse in particular I wanted us to lean into, and it's the opening verse there where we saw Paul's decision. There in Philemon 12, Paul writes these words, "I am sending him who is my very heart back to you." Paul is telling Philemon, I'm sending back to you Onesimus, your runaway slave. And then he uses this descriptor of the one he's identified he's sending back to him. He describes Onesimus as his very heart. But what's interesting there is that the word translated heart is not the typical cardia. Cardia is where we get the word cardiac from, hence heart being cardia. The word there is something different. It's splankthnon. Splankthnon. It's one of my favorite, funnest Greek words in the New Testament, and it literally is translated your deep internal organs, your guts, if you will. In Mark's gospel, when Jesus sees a crowd in the desolate place where they come to him, it says that he sees them and feels splankthnon toward them. That is, he sees them and feels compassion toward them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Here in Paul's text to Philemon, he's calling Onesimus his very splankthnon. He's saying, this guy, Onesimus, it's like he's got me in my deepest parts of my being. Here's what's interesting about splankthnon, though. It's not the only time that it shows up in Paul's letter to Philemon. If you remember back in verse 7, Paul says that he is so thankful to God for Philemon because of this reason. You, brother, have refreshed the hearts of the Lord's people. There. It's not you have refreshed the cardia, but the splankthnon. There's another moment, though. We're about to get into it this upcoming week, but I'll give you a little preview now. In verse 20, Paul invites Philemon to do for him the very thing he's done for the Lord's people. In verse 20, he says, refresh my, not cardia, refresh my splankthnon in Christ. Last week, we saw Paul say, I'm sending him back to you, him who is my very splankthnon, he who is my very heart. What Paul is doing is linking what Philemon has done for God's people to what he's going to ask Philemon to do for himself, to say at the center of both is what I'm asking you to do for Onesimus. On the one hand, this is interesting information that maybe you could just take, chuck, and throw away, but on the other hand, I believe it is very helpful for our faith. To see that what we do for God's people is also what we are called to do for those who, like Onesimus, wronged Philemon, owed him something. We're called to love our enemies and to see them even as God's very heart. You see, Jesus did not come to seek those who had it all together, but he came to seek those who were God's very enemies, to make them his very heart. You and I, we follow Jesus because this goodness was shown to us, not because we deserved it. It was beyond what we deserve. Paul's letter is instructive for us in our relationships with one another, not just to forgive, but to be restored and reconciled, so that together we can see one another as our very heart.